Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. So in my last video on weathering an Arco covered hopper, ran into a bit of a time crunch and wasn't able to finish. I had just gotten to the point where I was starting to use Pan Pastels on the roof and other parts of the car, and there was still a little bit left to go in terms of washes and things like that. So I decided to break the video into two parts so that it wouldn't run too long. So let's pick up where we left off. This video is brought to you in part by my patrons on Patreon. Follow the link in the description below to join the Pixel Depot's Patreon community and get exclusive patron-only benefits and goodies. The Patreon bonus for this video will be additional pictures of the weathering process. I'm also working on my first blooper reel, which should appear shortly, so check it out. But for this side, I'm going to actually try and work around that rust so that I don't have to worry about that so much. But I really like this light blue tint for really fading blue cars because they do tend to fade pretty heavily. You can see I'm trying to work around those rust spots there. It is kind of hard to get around those and not touch them at all, so I think what I'm going to do is not worry too much about it. I'm just going to go back and remove some of the Pan Pastel. If you've watched my previous videos, you know I've always got my blending brush here to kind of blend things in. If we compare the look of the photo with the look on the car, it's getting there pretty quickly. What I'm gonna do, I've just got some water here. It's kind of dirty, but it should do the trick. And just kind of run across here like so. Clean that off. Dab these areas there so you clean off the rust surfaces so that they show better. So I should be able to clean that up a little easier. It wasn't quite as messy on this side. Another thing I really like about the Pan Pastels is the really easy cleanup that comes along with it. So. And what I mean by that is if you don't like the way things look, some water or a baby wipe will take it right off. I'm gonna dab here rather than wipe, just so that I don't wipe off any of the stuff on the top of the car. I say that as I go and wipe it off. So take what I say with a grain of salt. It does look a little funny with the top of the car, sort of not quite faded like the rest of it is, so I'm just going to give this a quick coating. We'll assume that the top of the car is faded like the sides are, which would make sense. That's the spot that's going to get the most sunlight and UV rays. Fading, and I'm being pretty messy right now, but I will go back. I don't want a lot of the fading to be on the roof walk, so I'll go back with the wet towel, clean that off, dip that in my water, and we'll clean off these roof walks here from the fading piece of it anyway. Other thing that I'm going to do in 1 minute after I blend some of this in some more. Now there's water in between the etched roof walk that's in there, so I have to wait for that to dry a little bit. I'm going to take the clean end of my cotton swab and rub these hatches down a little bit. And the reason for that is often the hatches are a different material than the car is. So they might be some sort of plastic or composite or something along those lines. And they wouldn't fade the same way that the car might. Clean some of the fading of the Pan Pastel off on that and give it some contrast. I can also use my finger for that, and the oils from my finger will take some of that additional stuff off of there. So the roof is actually in pretty good shape now, in my opinion. I might do one more dab down here on this rust spot. A couple of these rust spots actually to make sure that they show up the way that I would like them to. I'm actually licking my finger and running it across here to clean off some more of that stuff from this top sill. I'd probably just as easily wet it in the water, but that's just the kind of guy I am. Alright. You'll notice too that I'm handling this car. The Pan Pastels do generally hold up pretty well to handling, so that's something you don't have to worry about too much. I mean, you don't want to rub your hands all over it once you're done, but it does hold up pretty well. What I do want to pay some attention to is the bottom of the car, so I'm going to grab my cradle here. I've had this cradle for many years. It's a foam cradle that you can sit cars in and locomotives and do work on the bottoms without having to worry too much about doing damage to the details. And what I am going to do is use a mixture of this dark gray, which is neutral gray shade, and raw umber, which is what I tend to use for dirt and dirty appearances. And we're just going to mix those up using my Deerfoot brush and dirty up the bottom of this car. Now, I didn't really get the matte finish on here, so this may not stick as well as is in other places, but given that it's underneath and you're not going to see it and not going to handle it very much, we should be okay. Once again, I'm not being too particular about the colors. I'm just kind of tapping in various places between the two. If we get any on the sides of the car, we can always wash it off like I showed you before. So this is really about just making it look like it's got that road grime on it. Trying to give it the look of having ridden the rails and picked up dirt and gunk and soot and grime along the way. If I'm not mistaken, this is an Atlas car, and so, while it's pretty well detailed, there's not a lot of very delicate details on the bottom. I don't have to worry too much about breakage or anything like that. So I can kind of go to town with this brush. You also want to get the coupler pockets and that area there. Spin this around, do the same thing on this side just to make sure that the blue is toned down. I'm also just going to give this a quick dusting of the raw umber over here to represent some dust on the bottom. What I'm also going to do is, I've been neglecting these ends. We'll get in there a little bit with some dirt. And there's just something else I'm going to do shortly after this to address that as well. Dirty this up some. The ends do tend to get pretty grimy and dirty, especially with the wheels from other cars kicking dirt and dust and junk up. You want to make sure that they don't look too clean. The other thing that this does is fade things down. Not as much as the tint did, but certainly does fade it down. Blend things in here. Pretty happy with the way the sill is coming out. It definitely looks like gunk and junk is sitting in there. The last thing I'm going to do, for Pan Pastels anyway, is just kind of hit some of these seams. Like I said earlier, some of them still looked a bit red, and right now I'm kind of going with the gray. And you can see from this photo that there is definitely a gray-ish tint coming down from the top. So if we get some of that look on here. Not go down quite as far with the first coat, and then when I blend here, yeah. So a couple of spots here where it's stuck in a line that I'm not thrilled with. So we're going to work on that. What we've got here, you can see, is there's a couple of lines there from the Pan Pastel. So what I'm going to do is go back to my marker here. I'm going to use those to my favor. So I've often seen cars that there's scratches down the side that have started to rust, and that's what we're going to do here. So, I'm going to use this paint marker here to represent that line. And that looks very bright right now, and from your angle looks very shiny. We let that dry. What I'm also going to do is, talked about this before, I'm going to make one area that's sort of new rust. And I'm going to do that here. That new rust is going to be lighter. Because if you look at a rust spot on a car, the new rust is always on the outside and the middle is darker. So I'm going to make that like that. Pull that down with the finger. And do a couple other spots like that in some of the other places. And just pull down and you get that rusty streak. You want to make sure you pull as close to straight down as you can, because that's the way that it's gonna run. But that'll take care of those lines. They're a little jagged still, so I'm gonna try and touch those up a little bit so that they look a little straighter and more natural. I don't know how well I'm gonna achieve that. Other thing that I'm gonna try is to use this bright rust color and the sort of wet micro brush that I have to put in some of that new rust looking spot there. So the combination of the wet paint, the slightly wet brush, and the Pan Pastel should force that to stick there when it's done. Ought to also give it a little bit of texture, which would be nice. So I'm only going to do that on this side. We're going to leave this side the way it is. I'm going to let that dry for a minute, and then I might go over it just one little extra tad with some more of the dirt to blend that in a little bit. But then we're going to move on to what I think is the final step. That should be dry enough. Give this a little touch up. Should have toned that down a little bit. That rusty area that I did with the paint marker is a little shiny, and rust is not shiny. So I want to make sure that we're covering that up. The Copic Sketch Markers that I used in this video are part number E09, which is burnt sienna, E29, which is burnt umber, and I'm also considering picking up the E97, which is deep orange, which I think will really give the impression of new orangey rust. And these three colors, being able to blend them together, I think will give a really good rust effect. Now the Pan Pastels tend to be a very dry medium, although you can make washes out of them. I've actually not tried that yet. But nothing makes something look oily like real oil, so for some things an oil paint wash can be really quite nice. And they also provide a very contrasting effect to the dry effect of the Pan Pastels. To make the washes I'm about to use, I used a small blob of oil paint. I used lamp black and burnt umber to make two different washes. The wash is a solution that I made using turpentine. You could also use turpenoid if that's something you prefer, and just adding more and more of the liquid until I got a watery wash that I knew would flow. Now, I don't have an exact ratio that I can give you because it's really going to depend on the amount of paint that you start with. Well, I mentioned earlier about how the ends get very, very dirty. I learned a trick from Mike Confalone, who I actually learned a lot of these tricks from in his video series. His suggestion was to make an oil wash, and this one is lamp black. What we are going to do is take those ends and make it look like there's been some oil and junk that's been thrown up. First thing we're going to do is use some of this lamp black wash right from the cap here, and just get in here on this platform. Give this some look as if there's oil and crud and things like that. And I know you can't see that very well, so let me try it once more. So I got that platform here, and I'm just gonna drop that in there. Just do some dots that will, because it's oil paint and in a solution of turpentine, or turpenoid actually. I'm just gonna drop some of those dots in there and make it look a little oily. There's a similar burnt umber wash you can use to add some rust spots and things like that to the ladders. And I don't know how well you can see on this. Hopefully that will adjust. If I just put a dot here, it kind of blends in, runs down. So you hit some of these ends, you get a nice rusty look. Now I should say that I don't usually go to this level of weathering with multiple steps and methods and paints and so on. I'm usually just a quick pan pastel guy, but I did want to show you guys some of the different things that could be done. So just hitting this area underneath the chain for some rust. Now the final step. Okay. So we're going to give that a quick slight dip. You don't want a ton of paint in that brush. The nice thing about this is it is in a line. You can really bring that back and flick. This one's a bit messy. I didn't do a very good job of getting it lined up with the wheel, but you can see that it gives you that oily black gunky look on there. Let's see if I can't do a better job here. Trying to line up the wheel. I didn't do a good job either. And let's try one more. Try and line up where the wheels would be. But if nothing else, you get that level of oily, grimy spotting that goes on there from stuff flying around. And because it's oil paint, it will do a good job. Now the challenge here is that normally I would seal that particular effect. Pan Pastels are better than some of the other weathering powders for not losing their potency after spraying it with dull coat or something like that, but they do fade some. And since I'm liking the way that this car came out and the level of dirt and grime that is on it. I don't want to seal it and potentially lose that. So that oil paint is going to stay wet for a little while because it's a wash and it's it's diluted in turpentine. It'll dry faster than a regular oil paint would, but it's still gonna take a little while. So I have to be careful not to handle those ends, otherwise it will spread. So I can still see pretty well the blue paint from the original model in there. So I'm just going in with this very thin brush and just throwing some oil on there. But I'm pretty happy with the way that came out. For now. My opinion may change later. Now, to be honest, under the harsh lights of the layout, the oil splatter effect didn't come out quite as well as I had hoped. I don't know if I was rushing it, or if it was the angle I was using in the hopes that you could see the effect on camera, or if I just need to use a different brush. Anyway, you look at it, I've had better luck with previous efforts, and I'll have to do some experimentation to get more of the line effect that I was looking for gunk coming off of the wheels. After giving this a look under the brighter lights of the layout, I thought that the dust effect that I put here on the side was a little much. So as one last step, I'm just going to do some rubbing on this to hopefully tone down some of that. Now, I have not washed my hands to take care of the oils that would normally be on my fingers, which is not necessarily a bad thing, as it should help to blend things. And I can see, even just from looking at this, that it has taken some of that and toned it down. You can see on my finger there's a bunch of gunk on there. So the reason for this really is that, in the pictures the car is not that dirty. It definitely has some grime on it and some streaking on that side, but it's not dusty looking. At least not as dusty looking as I had made it here. So the hope here is that I can just tone this down. So we'll put this back on the layout now, take some more pictures of it, and see where we stand. So after those final adjustments, I'm pretty happy with the dust effect on the sides of the car. Before doing that blend with my fingers, to me anyway, it looked like the car had rolled through the dusty plains very recently and not something that was arriving in the city on the East Coast. So I think that final blend makes a huge difference. As I mentioned, I normally wouldn't spend as much time as I did here on a single car. I usually prefer a quick, down and dirty, no pun intended, effect for my weathering. And honestly, I don't think you would want to go to this level on every car on your layout, especially if you have a small layout. Now, your mileage may vary on that, but for me, having a fleet of cars that blends nicely and don't do a lot to catch the eye, interspersed with a couple of cars that do have more detail to catch the viewer's eye, you maintain that viewer's interest a little better and don't give them visual fatigue with an overload of heavily detailed and weathered cars. So that's all for this episode. Let me know in the comments below how you think this car turned out and what you might have done differently if it was your project. As always, the comments are also the place for questions and suggestions. Just a reminder to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to get notified of new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links are in the description below. Finally, you can see more weathering projects by clicking in the upper left, as well as some other great content just below that. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room.